David Chen wiped down the counter for the third time that afternoon, his movements automatic after 15 years of working at Murphy's Diner. At 48, he had settled into a rhythm that rarely varied: morning shift, afternoon break, evening cleanup, then home to his small apartment above the Korean grocery store. The diner was nearly empty, as it usually was on Tuesday afternoons. Mrs. Patterson sat in her regular booth, nursing her coffee and working on a crossword puzzle. Two construction workers occupied the counter stools, discussing weekend plans over pie and coffee. The familiar sounds of sizzling bacon and clinking dishes created a comfortable backdrop to David's thoughts. He had worked at Murphy's since he was 33, when a series of bad decisions and worse luck had left him with few options and fewer prospects. The job wasn't glamorous, but it was steady, and Murphy had been kind enough to overlook David's lack of references and give him a chance when no one else would. David's life had become predictable in a way that was both comforting and suffocating. He knew every customer's usual order, every crack in the vinyl booth seats, every quirk of the ancient coffee machine that Murphy refused to replace. The routine had become his anchor, keeping him grounded when memories of his past mistakes threatened to pull him under. As he refilled the sugar dispensers, David found himself thinking about the dreams he'd once had: college, a career in engineering, maybe a family of his own. Those dreams felt like they belonged to someone else now, faded photographs of a life that had never quite materialized. The bell above the door chimed, and David looked up to see two figures silhouetted against the afternoon sunlight: a woman in an expensive-looking coat and a young girl, both standing in the doorway as if uncertain whether to enter. David straightened his apron and prepared to greet the new customers, unaware that his carefully ordered world was about to be turned completely upside down. Chapter 2. The Entrance. Elena Park stood in the doorway of Murphy's Diner, her heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and dread. After 3 years of searching, she had finally found David Chen, the man whose existence had been revealed to her in a letter that had changed everything she thought she knew about her best friend's life. Beside her, 12-year-old Sophie shifted nervously, her small hand gripping Elena's with surprising strength. The girl had been through so much in her young life, losing her mother, learning the truth about her parentage, and now facing the prospect of meeting a father who didn't even know she existed. Eleanor studied the man behind the counter, comparing his features to the faded photograph Maria had kept hidden in her jewelry box. 25 years had changed him, adding lines around his eyes and gray to his hair, but there was no mistaking the gentle expression and kind eyes that Maria had described in her letter. The diner was exactly what Elena had expected: a slice of Americana that seemed frozen in time, with its red vinyl booths, black and white checkered floor, and the lingering aroma of coffee and bacon grease. It was the kind of place where a man could disappear into routine, avoiding the complications and heartaches of a more ambitious life. Elena had rehearsed this moment countless times during the drive from San Francisco, but now that she was here, all her carefully planned words seemed inadequate. How do you tell a man that he has a daughter? How do you explain that the woman he once loved had kept such a monumental secret? Sophie looked up at her with questioning eyes, and Elena squeezed the girl's hand reassuringly. They had come too far to turn back now, and Sophie deserved to know her father, just as David deserved to know he had a daughter. Taking a deep breath, Elena stepped fully into the diner, the bell above the door announcing their arrival with a cheerful chime that seemed incongruously bright for such a momentous occasion. The man behind the counter looked up with a professional smile, and Elena felt her breath catch as she saw Maria's eyes reflected in his face. Chapter 3. Recognition. David's welcoming smile faltered as he got a better look at the woman approaching the counter. There was something familiar about her, though he couldn't place where he might have seen her before. She carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to being in control, her expensive clothes and perfect posture marking her as someone from a very different world than Murphy's Diner. The girl beside her was perhaps 12 or 13, with long dark hair and serious eyes that seemed too old for her young face. She stayed close to the woman, but her gaze wandered around the diner with curious interest, taking in the vintage decorations and worn furniture. "Good afternoon," David said, his voice carrying the practiced warmth of someone who had greeted thousands of customers over the years. "Table for two." Elena studied his face intently, and David felt increasingly uncomfortable under her scrutiny. There was something in her expression that suggested this wasn't a casual visit, that she had come here with a specific purpose that had nothing to do with the diner's famous apple pie. "Are you David Chen?" Elena asked, her voice steady despite the emotion David could see in her eyes. David's hand stilled on the coffee pot he'd been reaching for. In 15 years of working at Murphy's, no customer had ever asked for him by name. His first instinct was wariness. People from his past rarely brought good news. "Yes," he said carefully. "Do we know each other?" Eleanor glanced down at Sophie, who was watching the exchange with wide eyes. The girl seemed to understand that something important was happening, even if she didn't fully comprehend the implications. "My name is Elena Park," she said, extending her hand with formal politeness. "This is Sophie. We've come a long way to find you, Mr. Chen." David shook her hand automatically, his mind racing through possibilities. He had no memory of anyone named Elena Park, and he certainly didn't recognize the girl. But something about the way Elena was looking at him, with a mixture of sympathy and determination, made him deeply uneasy. "I'm sorry, but I don't think we've met," David said. "Are you sure you have the right person?" Elena's expression softened slightly. "We need to talk, Mr. Chen, about Maria Santos." Chapter 4. The Name from the Past. The coffee pot slipped from David's hand, clattering against the counter with a sound that seemed to echo through the suddenly quiet diner. Maria Santos. He hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in over 20 years, though it had never truly left his thoughts. Maria had been his first love, a brief but intense romance during his college years that had ended when she transferred to a school across the country. They had promised to stay in touch, but life had intervened in the way it often does, and their correspondence had gradually faded until it stopped altogether. David's hands trembled slightly as he steadied himself against the counter. "Maria," he whispered, the name feeling strange on his lips after so many years of silence. Elena watched his reaction carefully, seeing the confirmation she had been looking for in his expression. This was definitely the David Chen that Maria had written about, the young man she had loved but never forgotten. "You remember her," Elena said softly. It wasn't a question. "Of course I remember her," David replied, his voice thick with emotion. We dated in college, but that was 25 years ago. How do you know Maria? Is she—" Eleanor's expression grew somber. "Maria was my best friend. She passed away 3 years ago in a car accident." The words hit David like a physical blow. He gripped the edge of the counter, struggling to process the information. Maria was dead. The woman who had once filled his dreams and inspired his hopes for the future was gone, and he was only learning about it now, years after the fact. "I'm sorry," he managed to say. "I didn't know. We lost touch so long ago." Sophie had been watching the exchange with growing understanding. She stepped closer to Eleanor, seeking comfort in the familiar presence as the conversation grew more emotional. Elena placed a protective hand on Sophie's shoulder. "Before she died, Maria wrote a letter. She wanted me to find you, David. She wanted you to know about Sophie." David looked down at the girl with new attention, and suddenly the familiar feeling he'd had when they walked in made terrible, wonderful sense. Chapter 5. The Revelation. David stared at Sophie with new eyes, seeing details he had missed before. The shape of her nose, the way she tilted her head when she was thinking, the serious expression that had been his own trademark as a child. The resemblance was subtle but unmistakable once he knew what to look for. "She's—" David began, but couldn't finish the sentence. The implications were too enormous, too life-changing to put into words. "She's your daughter," Eleanor said gently. Maria never told you because she thought it would complicate your life. She was planning to raise Sophie alone, but she wanted you to know the truth eventually. Sophie looked up at David with curious eyes, studying the man who was apparently her father. She had grown up knowing that her father was someone her mother had loved but lost touch with, but meeting him in person was surreal and overwhelming. David felt his legs go weak. He reached for a nearby stool and sat down heavily, his mind reeling with the revelation. A daughter. He had a daughter, and she was standing right in front of him, a beautiful, intelligent-looking girl who had been living in the world for 12 years, without him knowing she existed. "I don't understand," David said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why didn't Maria tell me? I would have done something. I would have helped." Elena sat down across from him, pulling Sophie close. "She was scared, David. You were both so young and she didn't want to derail your future. She thought she was protecting you both." David looked at Sophie again, this time seeing not just a stranger's child, but his own flesh and blood. The girl who had been watching him with polite curiosity was his daughter, and he had missed 12 years of her life. "Sophie," he said softly, testing her name on his lips. "That's a beautiful name." Sophie smiled shyly. "Mom said you were kind," she said, speaking for the first time since entering the diner. "She said you had gentle hands and that you always tried to help people." David felt tears prick his eyes. Even after all these years, Maria had remembered him fondly, had spoken of him to their daughter with love and respect. Chapter 6. Processing the truth. The diner seemed to fade around them as David struggled to absorb the magnitude of what he was learning. Other customers continued their conversations, unaware that his entire world had just been redefined by the presence of a 12-year-old girl and the woman who had brought her to him. Eleanor reached into her purse and withdrew an envelope, yellowed with age and sealed with Maria's distinctive handwriting. "She wrote this for you," Eleanor said, placing it on the counter between them. "She wanted you to understand her decision." David stared at the envelope as if it might explode. Inside was Maria's voice from beyond the grave, her explanation for a secret that had shaped both their lives in ways he was only beginning to understand. Sophie had been watching the adults with the patience of a child who had learned to navigate complex emotional situations. "Are you sad that you didn't know about me?" she asked David, with the directness that only children possess. David looked into her eyes, his eyes, and felt his heart break and heal simultaneously. "I'm sad that I missed so much of your life," he said honestly, "but I'm not sad that you're here now." Elena had been observing their interaction carefully, looking for signs of how David might handle this unexpected responsibility. She had promised Maria that she would find Sophie's father, but she had also promised to protect Sophie from any situation that might harm her. "Sophie has been living with me since Maria died," Elena explained. "I've been her legal guardian, but Maria's letter made it clear that she wanted you to be part of Sophie's life if you were willing." David felt the weight of choice settling on his shoulders. He could acknowledge Sophie as his daughter and accept the responsibilities that came with that recognition, or he could maintain his simple, uncomplicated life and let Elena continue raising her. But looking at Sophie, seeing Maria's spirit reflected in their daughter's face, David knew there was really no choice at all. This girl was his family, the connection to love and purpose he had been missing without even realizing it. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice stronger than it had been since Elena first spoke Maria's name. Chapter 7. Elena's story. Elena had been watching David's reactions carefully, evaluating his character and his potential as a father figure for Sophie. What she saw gave her hope, genuine emotion, immediate acceptance, and a protective instinct that seemed to activate the moment he understood who Sophie was. "I should explain how I fit into this," Elena said, settling more comfortably in her seat. "Maria and I met in college after she transferred. We became best friends, and I was there when Sophie was born. I've been like an aunt to her all her life." Sophie nodded, confirming Elena's role in her life. "Elena taught me how to code," she said proudly, "and she helped me with my science projects." David smiled at the obvious affection between them. Whatever else was complicated about this situation, it was clear that Sophie had been loved and well cared for. When Maria died, Elena continued, she left me everything, including guardianship of Sophie. But she also left specific instructions about finding you. She had kept track of your life from a distance, knew you were working here. David felt a strange mixture of comfort and unease at the idea that Maria had been watching his life from afar. She knew where I was all this time? She did, Elena confirmed. She almost contacted you several times over the years, especially when Sophie started asking more questions about her father, but she was afraid of disrupting your life. Elena paused, choosing her words carefully. Maria also knew that you had struggled after college, that life hadn't gone the way you had planned. She didn't want to add to your burdens. David felt a flush of shame at the reminder of his failures. After Maria had left, his life had indeed spiraled downward. Dropped out of college, a series of dead-end jobs, some poor decisions that had left him with few options. I'm not exactly father material, David said quietly. I work in a diner, live in a one-bedroom apartment. I can barely take care of myself, let alone a child. Sophie looked at him with serious eyes. Elena is really rich, she said matter-of-factly, but that doesn't make her better than you. Mum said the best people are the ones who are kind, not the ones who have the most money. Chapter 8. The Successful Woman. Elena smiled at Sophie's characteristically direct assessment of the situation. The girl had grown up around wealth and success, but Maria had raised her to value character over material possessions. Sophie's right about my financial situation, Elena said without false modesty. I founded a tech company that did well, very well, but that's not why I'm here. David looked at Elena with new understanding. Her expensive clothes, her confident demeanor, the way she carried herself, it all made sense now. She was successful in ways he had never been, living the kind of life he had once dreamed of for himself. I'm here because I made a promise to my best friend, Elena continued, and because Sophie deserves to know her father. Money can provide a lot of things, but it can't replace family. David felt the contrast between their situations acutely. Elena could give Sophie everything, the best schools, travel, opportunities he could never afford. What could he possibly offer a child who had been raised in such privilege? As if reading his thoughts, Sophie spoke up. Elena told me you fix things, she said. She said you're good with your hands and that you help people. I like fixing things too. David looked down at his hands, calloused from years of manual work, but steady and capable. I do fix things, he said. The coffee machine, the grill, whatever breaks down around here. It's not very glamorous. Mom said you wanted to be an engineer, Sophie said. That's like fixing things, but bigger things, right? David nodded, touched that Maria had shared his old dreams with their daughter. That's right. I wanted to build bridges and buildings, things that would last. Elena watched this exchange with growing respect for David. Despite his obvious insecurity about his circumstances, he was connecting with Sophie naturally, speaking to her as an equal rather than talking down to her. Sophie is incredibly bright, Elena said. She's already taking advanced math and science courses. She gets that from both sides, I think. David felt a surge of pride at the idea that he might have contributed something positive to his daughter's development, even from a distance. Chapter 9. The Weight of Decision. Murphy appeared from the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron and looking curiously at the intense conversation taking place at his counter. David had been working for him for 15 years, and he had never seen his employee look so shaken. Everything okay out here, David? Murphy asked with genuine concern. David looked up at his boss, realizing that his entire life was about to change and that Murphy deserved some explanation. This is my daughter, he said simply, the words feeling strange but right on his lips. Murphy's eyebrows rose in surprise, but he recovered quickly. Well, I'll be damned, he said, extending his hand to Sophie. Nice to meet you, young lady. Your dad's a good man. Sophie shook his hand politely. "Thank you, sir. He seems very nice." Elena watched this interaction with interest, noting how the diner owner's casual acceptance seemed to bolster David's confidence. This was his community. These were people who knew and respected him. After Murphy returned to the kitchen, Elena leaned forward. "I need you to understand something, David. I'm not here to disrupt Sophie's life or to force you into a situation you're not ready for, but she needs to know her father, and you deserve the chance to know her." David looked at Sophie, who was studying the vintage photographs on the diner walls with obvious interest. "What does she want?" he asked. "Has anyone asked Sophie what she wants?" Sophie turned back to them, having overheard the question. "I want to know you," she said with the honesty that Elena had come to expect from her. "But I don't want to make your life harder." Elena says sometimes adults have to make difficult choices. David felt his heart break a little at the maturity in her voice. This child had learned too young that life was complicated, that love sometimes meant sacrifice. "You wouldn't make my life harder," David said firmly. "You would make it better. The question is whether I can make your life better too." Elena pulled out her phone and showed David a photo of Sophie's bedroom in her San Francisco penthouse, a space filled with books, art supplies, and the latest technology. "This is what I can give her," Elena said. "What can you give her?" David looked at the photo, then at the modest diner around them, feeling the weight of inadequacy. Chapter 10. Understanding Value. Sophie had been listening to the conversation with growing frustration. Finally, she spoke up with the kind of clarity that only children possess when adults are overcomplicating simple truths. "You're both being silly," she said, looking between Elena and David. "Elena gives me things and opportunities and education, but she can't give me a dad. And David, you can't give me expensive stuff, but you can give me a father. Why does it have to be one or the other?" Elena and David looked at each other, both struck by the wisdom in Sophie's words. They had been thinking in terms of competition when they should have been thinking in terms of collaboration. "She's right," Elena said slowly. "I've been approaching this wrong. This isn't about choosing between two different lives for Sophie. It's about creating a life that includes both of us." David felt a weight lift from his shoulders. "You mean we could both be part of her life? You wouldn't mind sharing?" "Mind?" Elena laughed. "David, I've been raising a child alone for 3 years while running a company. Do you have any idea how exhausting that is? Sophie needs more than one person in her corner." Sophie grinned, pleased that the adults were finally understanding what seemed obvious to her. "Plus, Elena travels a lot for work. Sometimes I get lonely in that big apartment." David looked around the diner, imagining Sophie spending time here, maybe helping him with small tasks or doing homework in one of the booths. The image felt right in a way that surprised him. "I don't have much to offer," David said, "but I could teach her practical things. How to fix things, how to work with her hands. Maybe we could work on projects together." "She would love that," Eleanor said. "Sophie is always taking things apart to see how they work. I have to hide my electronics from her." Sophie bounced slightly in her seat. "Could I really come here sometimes? Could you teach me how the coffee machine works?" David smiled, the first genuine smile he had managed since Eleanor had spoken Maria's name. "I could teach you lots of things, if that's what you want." "It is," Sophie said firmly. "I want to know my dad, and I want him to know me." Chapter 11. Building Bridges. Over the next hour, the three of them began to sketch out what their new relationship might look like. Elena explained that she had been planning to relocate her company's headquarters anyway, and the Bay Area had several locations that would work well for her business while being closer to David. "I could find a place maybe an hour away," Elena suggested. "Close enough for regular visits, far enough to give you space to build your own relationship with Sophie." David felt overwhelmed by Elena's generosity and her obvious commitment to making this work for everyone involved. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. "You could have just kept raising her yourself. She's happy with you." Elena was quiet for a moment, considering how to explain the complex emotions that had driven her search for David. "Because Maria asked me to," she said finally. but also because Sophie deserves to know where she comes from, and because I think you deserve to know her too." She paused, looking at Sophie, who was now examining the vintage jukebox in the corner. "And honestly, because I've seen how much she wants a father. She's never said anything, but I can see it in the way she watches other families, the questions she asks about you." David followed Elena's gaze to Sophie, who was trying to read the song titles through the jukebox's glass. "She really wants to know me?" "She's wanted to know you her whole life," Elena said softly. "Maria used to tell her stories about you, about how kind you were, how you always tried to help people. Sophie has been building an image of her father based on those stories." David felt the weight of expectations settling on his shoulders. What if I disappoint her? What if I'm not the man Maria described? Eleanor studied his face, seeing the genuine concern and self-doubt. "David, in the past hour, you've shown more care and consideration for Sophie's well-being than some fathers show in a lifetime. You're already better than you think you are." Sophie returned to their table, having successfully gotten the jukebox to play an old song. "I like this place," she announced. "It feels like the kind of place where people tell stories and take care of each other." Chapter 12. New Beginnings. 6 months later, David stood in the doorway of Murphy's Diner, watching Sophie help Elena set up a laptop computer on one of the corner tables. Elena had indeed relocated her business, purchasing a building in the nearby town of Millfield, where she could run her company while being close enough for regular visits. Sophie now spent every other weekend with David, and their relationship had grown stronger with each visit. She had learned to operate the coffee machine, could make a decent grilled cheese sandwich, and had helped David repair everything from the diner's ancient cash register to Murphy's temperamental truck. More importantly, they had learned to talk to each other. Sophie shared stories about school, her friends, and her dreams of becoming an engineer like David had once wanted to be. David told her about his childhood, his mistakes, and the lessons he had learned from both success and failure. Elena had become more than just Sophie's guardian. She had become David's friend and partner in raising their remarkable daughter. She brought resources and opportunities that David could never provide, while he offered stability, practical skills, and the kind of unconditional love that only a parent could give. "Ready for our engineering project?" Sophie asked, looking up from the laptop where she'd been researching bridge designs. David smiled, tying on his apron for what would be his last shift at Murphy's. Tomorrow, he would start his new job at Elena's company, where she had created a position that would use both his practical skills and his long-dormant engineering knowledge. "Ready?" he said, sitting down beside his daughter. Elena looked up from her work, watching father and daughter bend over the computer screen together, their heads close as they discussed load-bearing calculations and structural integrity. Maria would have been proud to see them together, she thought, finally building the bridge that would connect their separate worlds into one family. Outside, the afternoon sun streamed through the diner windows, illuminating the three people who had found each other across years of separation and loss. Sometimes, the most important journeys begin with a simple decision to walk through a door, and sometimes the families we need most are the ones we never knew we were looking for. The future stretched ahead of them, full of possibility and promise, built on the foundation of love that Maria had left behind, and the courage that had brought them all together in a small diner on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon that had changed everything. Thank you for joining us for this heartwarming story about family, second chances, and the unexpected ways that love finds us when we need it most. David, Elena, and Sophie's journey reminds us that family isn't always about biology. Sometimes it's about the choice to love and care for each other, regardless of the circumstances that bring us together. This story celebrates the courage it takes to open our hearts to new possibilities, the wisdom of children who see simple truths that adults often miss, and the power of friendship to create families that transcend traditional boundaries. Sometimes the most ordinary moments hold the most extraordinary potential for transformation.